Welcome back to Summerlands. I'm your host, Eva. It's been a little while, and I hope your summer has been treating you well. Before we jump into today's episode, let's quickly reconnect with where we left off. In the last few episodes, we followed the drug market from different angles. We look at PBMs and how they shape what happens after a doctor writes a prescription. We look at the manufacturer side of the system, how a scientific breakthrough becomes a product, a launch, a price, a rebate, and eventually a coverage negotiation. And most recently, we look at GLP-1s, where resellings move fast, but the access system struggle to keep up. And today, we move to another part of the same story, drug prices. More specifically, what happens when Washington stops relying only on private plans and PBMs to negotiate prices and starts naming the price itself? This episode is about the Inflation Reduction Act, but I don't want to treat it as a policy explainer because the interesting question is not just what the IRA says. The interesting question is what changed once Medicare became an active price negotiator. For almost 20 years, Medicare paid for prescription drugs through a system where private plans negotiated, PBMs managed formularies, manufacturers set list prices, and rebates moved behind the scenes. Then, the IRA changed the architecture, not all at once, not for every drug, not in a clean, simple way, but enough to send a new signal through the entire drug market. So let's start where this signal becomes visible. It's January 5th, 2026. We're in Ohio. It's a local pharmacy counter. The post-holiday slump is just in full effect. There is snow on the ground, it's freezing, and a 68-year-old retiree walks up to the register, and she's there to pick up her prescription for Farxiga. It is something she takes every single day to manage her condition, so she knows this routine. Last month in December of 2025, her copay for a month's supply of this exact same low pill was $195. But today, the pharmacist scans the barcode, looks at the screen, and just rings her up for $47, a nearly $150 drop overnight. So she obviously asked the pharmacist, was there a mistake? Did she suddenly hit some magic insurance threshold she didn't know about? And the pharmacist just shakes his head and goes, your plan price changed this month. Simple as that. No, she didn't know the mechanics behind it. She didn't know all the policy algorithms we are going to get into. She just knows that from her vantage point, something in the system fundamentally shifted in her favor. And here is where the story really begins. I want you to imagine a second scene happening on that exact same day. Cut to a corporate office tower. You've got a Bristol Myers group sitting at their desk, just staring at this massive complex spreadsheet. They're revisiting their entire revenue model for the year for a blockbuster blood thinner called Alquist. Because Alquist just went from a $521 list price down to a $231 negotiated price in Medicare, a 56% discount. And considering Medicare represents roughly half of the entire US book of business for that specific drug, the accountant's model is no longer works the same way. We can actually add a third thing to that montage. Still January 5th, 2026, let's go to an office in Minneapolis. You've got a health plan actuary for a major Medicare Part D insurance plan, and they're looking at their own modeling software. They're looking at the exact same drugs, the exact same new lower government negotiated prices that the patient in Ohio is thrilled about. And this actuary is realizing that their health plan's financial liability for those exact same medication has increased materially. So price went down, but their liability went up because the entire benefit design changed. Today we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. The specifically is Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program. The IRA didn't just end the old drug pricing game, it ruled the rules midpoint. We are looking at a massive systemic event where every single player, from the pharmaceutical manufacturers to the pharmacy benefit managers, Wall Street investors to patients picking up their meds. Everyone is adapting to a new reality, which is that Washington is not setting the prices. To understand why this happened in 2026, we can't just start in 2026. We really have to rewind the clock and look at the structural foundation of how Medicare actually pays for drugs. We have to go back to 2003, when Congress created Medicare Part D to finally give seniors prescription drug coverage. They included a provision that ended up shaping the next 2 decades. The law explicitly prohibits the federal government from directly negotiating the price of the drugs it was buying, which, when you think about it, sounds crazy today. But the logic at the time was deeply rooted in a belief in the free market. The bet was that private health plans and their middlemen, the pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs, would negotiate on Medicare behalf. Like the theory was that private market competition would drive down costs far more effectively than some federal bureaucracy dictating terms. For 20 years, the entire U.S. drug supply chain built its business models on top of that specific foundation. PBMs became these massive, heavily consolidated entities. Manufacturers learned exactly how to maximize their revenues within that fragmented indirect negotiation structure. Imagine you are throwing a massive corporate dinner for thousands of people. You, the company, are footing the entire bill. But by law, you are literally not allowed to look at the menu prices. And you are explicitly forbidden from speaking to the chef. You have to hire a middleman, a party planner, to go into the back room and haggle for you. And you just have to hope they secure a great deal on the prime rib when you blindly write the checks. And the problem with writing blank checks in healthcare, though, is that the numbers eventually catch up to you. By the 2010s, massive cracks were appearing in that free market foundation. These prices for the Medicare biggest, most heavily utilized drugs were just climbing vastly, outpacing standard inflation. And insulin became the symbolic face of this issue. Let's talk about the math. Medicare accounts for roughly 40% of all U.S. drug spending. We're talking about $240 billion out of a $550 billion total market, and by 2024, total Medicare spending on drugs hit $350 billion annually. Pressure was immense. You had public polling showing upwards of 80% support for Medicare negotiation, spanning literally every demographic and political affiliation. There were multiple legislative attempts over the years, the Waxman Bill, H.R. 3 back in 2019, but they all failed. The legislative dam basically held until August 16, 2022. The IRA was passed. And I think it is worth noting the mechanics of how it was passed. It was passed via budget reconciliation. Budget reconciliation is this legislative tool that allows a bill to pass the Senate with a simple majority of 51 votes, completely bypassing the 60-vote filibuster. Because the catch is that every single provision in the bill must be strictly tied to federal spending or revenue. You can't just write broad sweeping healthcare policy, it has to be a math equation. which is why the IRA's drug pricing pillars are structured so rigidly around Medicare spending. So inside this massive piece of legislation, there were three core components. First, you have the Medicare drug pricing negotiation program. The government finally talking to the shelf. And second, inflation rebates. Basically, if a drug company raises its prices faster than the rate of inflation, they have to pay Medicare the difference back as a rebate. And third, a completely redesigned Part D benefit structure. And the initial projections from the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, back in September 2022, projected this would save the federal government an estimated $288 billion over 10 years. And out of that, $102 billion was expected to come directly from the negotiation price alone. You may ask PBMs were already negotiating massive rebates, but those rebates created what cut the gross to net bubble. Manufacturers set a high list price, that is the gross. The PBM negotiates a massive rebate, lowering the actual cost to the insurer, that is the net. But the PBM often keeps a percentage of that rebate, or they charge fees based on the list price. So the PBM actually benefits from higher list prices. They want the manual price to be 1,000 so they can prove they get a 500 discount, even if the food was really only worth 200 to begin with. And worse, the patient's co-insurance at the pharmacy counter, like what the retiree in Ohio was paying, was often calculated based on that artificial inflated list price, not the secret net price. The government looked at that dynamic and realized the opaque middleman-driven model was inherently inflationary. It just wasn't surprising the sheer volume of Medicare spending fast enough. Washington realized they need a structural mechanism to force the top-line number down, regardless of whatever rebate gains were happening underneath. Which brings us to the actual execution. Because passing a reconciliation bill is just theory. Executing it in the real world is where the mechanics of power come into play. How does the government actually pick its targets? I mean, how do they force a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical manufacturer to just accept a price? The law dictates a highly structured, very rigid process, and it starts with eligibility. The government just can't point at any expensive drug and demand a discount. First, a drug is only eligible if it's a single-source brand-name drug with no generic or biosimilar competition on the market. They are specifically targeting monopolies. The drug must have been on the market for a specific amount of time. It must be 7 years post-approval for small molecule drugs, which are typically your standard chemical pills, or 11 years post-approval for biologics, which are complex, large molecule drugs usually administered by injection or infusion. Why did Congress choose those exact numbers, 7 and 11? What is fascinating here is that the rationale really blends biologic complexity with political compromise. Biologics are living cells. They are vastly more complex to manufacture. Their clinical trials are often longer, and the cost of failure is huge. So Congress gives them 11 years of runway to recoup that massive R&D reinvestment. Small molecules are chemical synthesized. They are much easier to produce at scale once the formula is cranked. So they only got 7 years. But as we will see when we look at the capital markets a bit later, that 4-year difference isn't just a minor technicality. It's actually redirecting billions of dollars in global biotech investment away from pills or injections. It's a massive market distortion. Once you have this pool of eligible drugs, the monopolies have aged past their 7 or 11-year marks. How does the CMS select which ones to negotiate? You think about they look at which drugs will have pike in price the most, or maybe analyze the clinical value to the patient, like does this drug actually cure the disease or just manage symptoms, right? But they look none of that. The selection mechanism is blunt. CMS rank all of the eligible drugs purely by total gross Medicare spend. They literally just take the expenditures, rank them from the highest to lowest, and draw a line. The signal to the manufacturers is Untitled Chapter. If your drug becomes too successful, if you capture too much volume in the Medicare population, you get selected. You're literally penalized for scale. But the list isn't absolute. There are some intense battlegrounds over exclusions, and this is where the lobbying money starts flowing. The law initially carved out exceptions for low-spend drugs, plus temporary for small biotech drugs, and crucially for certain orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are medication developed specifically to treat real diseases, which is defined as a condition affecting fewer than 200,000 people in the US. But the orphan drug exclusion became the biggest loophole in the RA. Initially, the law said an orphan drug was only exempted if it has a single designation for one rare disease. If a company got approval to use that same drug for a second rare disease, they lost the exemption. However, July 2025 legislation, known as One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA, fundamentally changed the math. It broadened the orphan drug exclusion so that drugs with multiple orphan indications remain exempt. The negotiation clock only starts ticking when a drug gets a non-orphan massive market approval. And it showed mega blockbuster cancer drugs, like look at Keytruda. Merck's Keytruda did $32 billion in sales in 2025 alone. But because Merck has systematically pursued dozens of specific real tumor indications for Keytruda, a strategy called Salome slicing, OBBA potentially did this Keytruda's negotiation eligibility by a full decade. They carved the market into these tiny real slices, and the CBO had to revise the cost of this specific carve-out upward. They estimate this legislative trick would cost the government $8.8 billion in lost savings over 10 years. Okay, so CMS filtered through the exclusions, they ranked the remaining drugs by total expend, and they pushed the list. Then what? CMS sent an initial offer to the manufacturer, accompanied by consent certification. The manufacturer can accept it, or they can make a counteroffer. They are allowed up to 3 meetings to discuss the data, and finally, CMS sends a written final offer. And here's one question. If I'm a massive pharma company and I look at the government final offer and decided to charge my margins, why don't I just walk away from the table? What is compelling them to agree? The IRA includes a mechanism that the industry views as a threat. If a manufacturer refuses to negotiate or refuses to accept the final price, they are hit with an excise tax. And this isn't a standard corporate tax. It starts at 65% and ramps up to 95% of the drug's total US gross sales. The only way to legally avoid the tax, if you refuse to agree, is to pull off your company's drugs, your entire portfolio, out of Medicare or Medicaid entirely, which is roughly 40% of the entire US healthcare market. No public traded companies could survive that. So let's call it what it is. If the government can hit you with a 95% tax or force you to abandon half your market for working away, the pharmaceutical industry agreed with you. They sued, repeatedly arguing it was extortion. But from the government perspective, this is voluntary market condition. The government is a sovereign buyer. If you want access to the massive federal purchaser, you play by the sovereign rules, and the rules dictate a maximum fair price, or MFP. And how that MFP actually calculated? There are hard statutory ceilings. The MFP couldn't exceed the lower of the drug's net Part D price or a strict percentage of the average non-federal price. The percentage depends on how long the drug has held its monopoly. It ranges from 75% for drugs on the market for 9 to 12 years, down to 40% for drugs having monopolies for 16 years or more. CMS takes that selling at the starting point, and they consider specific factors to adjust the final number. They look at how much it costs to research and develop the drug, unit production cost, whether initial research have federal funding like NIH grants, and how the drug companies communicate to existing alternative treatments. But what they explicitly don't look at, or QALYs. Quality adjusted life years. A QALY is a metric used heavily in European single-payer systems to determine if a drug is cost-effective. It essentially puts a dollar value on a year of perfect health. But in the US, patient advocacy groups strongly oppose QALYs, arguing they discriminate against the disabled and the elderly by valuing their lives less, so the RA forbids using them. Okay, so we've seen the rulebook, the 7 and 11-year eligibility, and total spending selection, the OBBA exclusions, the 95% tax ultimatum, the statutory selling. Let's look at the scoreboard. Who actually got hit in these first few rounds of selection? And what does it tell us about the Pharma playbook? Let's start with cycle 1. These are the 10 drugs where the prices literally just took effective in January 2026. These are the absolute workhorses of the Medicare system. You have cardiovascular drugs like Alquist, Xarelto, and Entresto. You have diabetes drugs like Januvia, Jardiance, Farxiga, and Novolog. You have autoimmune biologics like Enbrel and Stelara, and one blood cancer drug Imbruvica. In 2023, just these 10 medications represents $56 billion in gross Part D spend. That was roughly 20% of all Part D spending on 10 drugs. The concentration of spend is exactly why they were targeted. And the discount the government secured was substantial. They range from a 38% discount off list price for Imbruvica all the way to 79% discount for Januvia. And Eliquis, which our pro accountant earlier was sweating over, took a 56 hit, dropped to an MFP of 231. What about cycle 2? That list price was finalized for price taking effect in 2027. Cycle 2 is when the GLP-1s enter the area. We are talking about 15 drugs total, but the undeniable headline is Ozempic and Wegovy. CMS negotiated a maximum fair price of $274 for Ozempic. This is a massive 71 discount from the $902 price. In November 2025, just before the cycle 2 prices were finalized, the Trump administration announced an executive action, a most favored nation deal with Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. The executive branch secured deal to provide those GLP-1s to Medicare at $245. The IRA, a statutory law passed by Congress, spent a year grading through a rigid regulatory negotiation process to get Ozempic down to $274. And then the executive branch swaps in, signs a deal, and sets the price at $245. And CMS had to officially issue guidance clarifying that the MFN price legally supersedes the IRA negotiated price. So for Ozempic, the IRA price of $274 is effectively a final number on a spreadsheet. It creates chaos for the people actually operating the healthcare system. But the train keeps moving, because in cycle 3, which is currently negotiating for 2028 prices, 15 more drugs were selected, and this time a massive barrier was broken. For the first time, Part B drugs were in crosshairs. These are not the pills you pick up at CVS. These are physician-administered products. infusions and injections done in a doctor's office or hospital outpatient clinic. Drugs like Botox, Xelia, and Simdea. Targeting Part B is a monumental shift because it attacks the buy and bill system. Under buy and bill, a local oncology clinic actually purchases the expensive infusion drug themselves. They float the cost, then they administer it to the patient. They bill Medicare for the drug plus a markup, usually the average sales price plus 6%, or sometimes 4% depending on sequestration. That percentage markup is how independent clinics keep their lights on. It pays for the specialized nurses, the infusion chairs, and overhead. So by targeting Part B, the government isn't just squeezing the profit margins of massive pharma companies in New Jersey, they're bringing local providers directly into the crosshairs of margin compression. If the government slashes the price of the drug by 60%, the doctor's 6% markup drops by 60% in absolute dollars. It fundamentally alters the economics of specialized medical practice. Independent clinics are warning that if their drug margins collapse, they will have to consolidate with massive hospital systems or shut down entirely. Let's step back and look at the whole board here. We've got drug thinners, diabetes meds, biologics for autoimmune disease, and now Part B infusions. What is a pattern? What connects these specific targets? If we connect this to the bigger picture, the selected drugs tells a very clear story about pharmaceutical commercialization strategy. The government is specifically targeting cardiovascular blockbuster at the tail end of their life cycles. They are targeting diabetes drugs with continually expanding indications, and they are targeting autoimmune biologics while companies successfully utilize patent thickets to delay biosimilar competition for years. The IRA is aiming directly at the most financially successful commercialization strategies of the last 2 decades. It is deliberately dismantling the evergreen incentives. The negotiation list is the shiny object. It gets all the press releases and the headlines. But there's a whole other half of the IRA story that is arguably more impactful. The hidden engine room of Medicare Part D has been completely rebuilt. The negotiation program changed the price of specific drugs, but the Part D redesign changed the foundational financial incentives of the entire insurance market. This is where the deepest structural shifts are actually occurring. What actually changed in Part D on January 1st, 2025? The old system had 4 distinct phases, including the donut hole coverage gap, where patients were suddenly on the hook for a huge percentage of the drug cost mid-year until they spent their way out of debt. The IRA wiped a structure out of completely. It eliminated the donut hole entirely. It capped insulin copays at $35 a month. It made recommended vaccine free, and it introduced the Medicare prescription payment plan, which allows patients to spread their out-of-pocket cost into monthly installments, like a utility bill, rather than facing a massive lump sum in January. It's an upgrade in patient experience. The redesign was implementing a hard $2,000 annual out-of-pocket cost for beneficiaries. It's indexed to inflation, so for 2026, it sits at $2,100. Once a patient hits that gap, they pay absolutely nothing for their covered drugs for the rest of the year. This is generally life-changing for someone on expensive specialty meds. But as we know in healthcare economics, funding doesn't just disappear. Risk doesn't evaporate, it just moves. If the patient isn't paying for anything past $2,000, someone else is holding the bag. Where did the liability go? This is the liability shock our actuary in Minneapolis was fighting over. Let's break down the money flow in the catastrophic phase. This is a phase after a patient hits their out-of-pocket maximum. Because the IRA Medicare itself, meaning the federal government stepped in and covered 80% of all drug costs in that catastrophic phase through a mechanism called reinsurance. So the federal government was acting as the ultimate safety net for the sickest, most expensive patients. The health plans were largely shared from the worst-case scenarios, but under the redesign benefit, the government slashed its reinsurance from 80% down to just 20%. The private health plans now have to take on massive liability, jumping from covering 15% of catastrophic costs to 60%. And the pharmaceutical manufacturers are forced to pay a 20% discount in that phase as well. The government essentially took the most expensive risk pool in the country, shifted off its own books, and dumped it onto the balance sheets of the private insurers and the drug makers. What did that do to the health plan's bottom lines? For beneficiaries with chronic conditions like diabetes or asthma, net plan liability, the extra amount of the insurance company has to pay out of its own pocket, rose by 55 to 91 post-redesign. And it gets worse for complex care. For specialty therapeutic areas, oncology, multiple sclerosis, autoimmune diseases, plan liability rose by staggering 171 to 130%. And how do insurers normally recoup massive cost spikes? They raise premiums. But the writers of the IRA anticipated the exact same actual reaction. They knew that shifting the liability would spike premiums, which is politically suicide. So they include a premium stabilization provision in the law. It legally caps the growth of the basic premium at just 6% per year through 2029. You mandate the insurers to cover a 230% cost increase, but you legally forbid them from raising their premiums by more than 6%. An insurer would just become insolvent and exit the market. To balance the equation and provide the max exodus of health plans, the federal government has to step in and heavily subsidize the gap. They're writing massive checks directly to the health plans to keep premiums artificially suppressed below that 6% cap. Because even with those massive federal subsidies, the health plans still have to manage their internal risk pools, and they're finding other ways to pass the buck. Study published in JAMA Internal Medicine from August 2025 that checked the unintended flow of those costs exposed the absolute paradox of the redesign. What they found was that Medicare beneficiaries without high drug costs, that relatively healthy seniors who take maybe a cheap generic for cholesterol and nothing else, were actually seeing their total premium, their co-insurance rate for those cheap generics increase. Because the insurers are taking the massive cost of that 2,000 cap for the sickest patients and spreading it across the entire pool of healthy patients. The winners and losers are sitting right next to each other inside the exact same benefit design. So we essentially built a system that blindly protects the sickest, most vulnerable patients from financial ruin, but passes the bill directly to healthiest patients and the federal deficit. Let's complicate that a little bit. Is this a bug in the IRA, or is it exactly how insurance is theoretically supposed to work? I mean, the healthy always subsidize the sick, right? Philosophically and actually, yes. This is the definition of insurance, risk pooling. But politically, it is incredibly dangerous when millions of seniors who barely use the pharmacy since the monthly fixed cost goes up to pay for a government promise they aren't utilizing. This brings us to one of the most developments in the whole story, the CBO reversal. Back in 2022, when the IRA was passed, the Congressional Budget Office projected that drug provisions would reduce the federal deficit by $129 billion over 10 years. That was the primary selling point for passing it through reconciliation. It was supposed to save government money. But in July 2026, the CBO released an updated retrospective report based on actual market data. They entirely reversed their projection. They now say that the drug provision of the IRA will actually increase federal deficit over the 2022 to 2031 window. How does a premium nonpartisan scoring entity in Washington get the math that wrong? It comes down to behavior economics and price elasticity. Three massive things happened that the CBO's initial models underestimated. First, because out-of-pocket costs dropped so dramatically for patients, thanks to 2000 caps, patients start using more drugs. They stop rationing their specialty meds. They fill prescriptions they previously would have abandoned at the counter. Increased adherence means increased utilization, which means increased total spend. And second, the cost of redesigning Part D. Specifically, those massive federal subsidies required to keep plan premiums under the 6% cap were vastly higher than expected because plan bids came in and held. And the third reason, the CBO realized they overestimated the government leverage in the actual negotiations. The net savings generated from the maximum fair pricing cycle 1 and 2 was smaller than they originally modeled, partly because PBMs were already extracting such deep rebates in some of those highly competitive drug classes. So the hidden engine of Part D is running white hot, burning through federal cash to subsidize premiums and fund increased utilization. While the negotiation program is aggressively squeezing the margins on the top tier of drugs, which leads us to the inevitable next question. How does the pharmaceutical industry react to all of this? We have a system that is fundamentally hostile to high-volume Medicare success. The manufacturers looking at this brand ongoing just accept margin compression and politely retreat. They're adapting, and their strategic response is fundamentally altering the landscape of medical innovation in real time. Let's go back to that pill penalty we discussed earlier. 7 years of exclusivity for small molecule pills, 11 years for biologics. How is the venture capitalist and the capital market reacting to that 4-year gap? A comprehensive study published in the journal Value in Health in June 2026 laid out the stark data. Following the passage of the IRA, venture capitalist investment in early-stage small molecule startups crashed by roughly 68%. It dropped from around $2 billion in funding down to just $640 million. Meanwhile, investment in biologics in 2024 were about 10 times higher than for small molecules. The capital markets have officially priced in the 4-year penalty. Investor look at the Brian pitch for a small molecule pill and says, even if you succeed, you only get 7 years on the market before the government slash your price by 60%. A biologic, you got 11 years, the math doesn't work. We are putting our money in biologics. And that translates directly into launch pricing. Because the pre-negotiation window, those 7 or 11 years, is not the only guarantee window of return on investment. Launch prices for new drugs are skyrocketing. Even major pharma companies modeling their launch prices with the IRA countdown clock ticking loudly in the back. In a survey of life science investor in 2025, 87% stated the IRA was making it harder to bring in innovative medicines to market, and almost all of them admittedly they were pushing portfolio companies to launch as massive premiums and target the largest possible patient populations right out of gate to maximize early revenue. because you couldn't afford to launch small, prove that the concept in a niche population, and grow organically anyway. The clock is ticking, and what about the drugs that are already out there? How does a massive company manage the life cycle of the drug that is about to hit the negotiation list? The life cycle management gets hyper aggressive. CMS actually flagged an emergent program integrity risk for 2028 negotiation cycle. They noted that manufacturers are exploring adding entire new active ingredients to existing older drugs just to legally create a new product and delay their eligibility for the negotiation. And then you have portfolio prioritization strategies. You see a clear fascinating divergence in how massive companies are navigating this based on what they have in their pipeline. I was looking at Bristol Myers Squibb's Q2 earnings from 2026, and they seem to have totally pivoted to survive the hit on Alcos. In mid-2024, their CEO told investors they were confidently they could manage the coming hit on Alcos because they were aggressively leaning into their newer growth portfolio drugs that were years away from IRA eligibility. And the strategy worked. By Q2 2026, their growth portfolio was driving 60% of their total revenue. They successfully diversified their reliance away from the Negotiator drug. But not every drug has a deep bench of new drugs ready to go. What about Merck? Merck has a completely different structural problem. Keytruda is a $30 billion juggernaut that accounts for a massive chunk of their valuation. They initially warned investors to expect Keytruda to be negotiated in 2026. But remember OBBA, the orphan drug carve-out we discussed, July 2025 bill that protected drugs with multiple orphan indications. That legislative victory brought Merck a decade of breathing room. So their strategy relies heavily on defending that legislative carve-out while they rush to build an impenetrable patent pipeline around a new sub-Q version of Keytruda. They're changing the delivery mechanism from an IV infusion to an injection under the skin, hoping to transition patients to a new patent product version before the old one eventually gets negotiated. So strategy is now a mix of intense lobbying, formulation tricks, and raising the clock. And let's talk about the most aggressive counter move. Merck, BMS, Johnson & Johnson, Novo Nordisk, Eli Lilly, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they all filed sweeping lawsuits between 2023 and 2026. The legal arguments were fascinating. They argued the negotiation process was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, unconstitutional taking of private property without just compensation. They also argued violate the First Amendment by compelled speech, essentially forcing them to sign an agreement stating a price was fair when they believed it was extortion. They lost comprehensively. Every single lower federal court ruled against them. The Third Circuit, the D.C. District Court, they all rejected the arguments. The judges systematically ruled that participation in Medicare is entirely voluntary. The government isn't seizing your property, it's offering you a contract. If you don't like the terms of the federal contract, you are free to walk away and sell your drug elsewhere. The courts ruled that economic pressure doesn't equal unconstitutional coercion. And finally, in May 2026, the Supreme Court denied certiorari on all pending petitions from the pharmaceutical industry. They simply refused to hear the cases, so the legal war is completely over. Adoption is now the only path forward. The IRA is a permanent structural feature of the U.S. healthcare system. Washington is adapting by layering executive orders over statutes. Pharma is adapting by fleeing small molecules and tricking formularies. But what about the massive middlemen who used to control those whole game, the PBMs? party planners who used to negotiate the secret rebates if the government is now setting the price, do the PBMs just go extinct? The rebate era doesn't disappear, it mutates. And this is where the system's logic got incredibly complex. PBMs revolve around the difference between list price and net price. Pre-IRA, PBMs negotiated massive rebates offer drugs artificially high list price. But when the government steps in to negotiate the maximum fair price, they're negotiating a discount of that public list price. The problem, and this is a paradox, is that for several of the top drugs selected in Cycle 1, the government's shiny new negotiated MFP was actually higher than the net price the Part D plans were already paying after their PBMs had extracted confidential rebates. Because the PBMs were so ruthlessly at squeezing rebates in higher competitive drug classes like diabetes. The net price they achieved was sometimes lower than the government's statutory selling, which means that the MFP kicks in and legally replaced the old system. Some plans actually saw their costs go up for that specific drug because their lucrative rebate system were wiped out. The government accidentally raised the net price for some plans by trying to lower the top line prices. So if the PBM lose their rebate leverage on the negotiated drugs in Medicare, what do? If we connect this to a bigger picture, the PBMs take this public MFP and they weaponize it in the commercial market. Surveys of the pharmacy benefit leaders from mid-2026 show a massive shift in tactics. 59% of paid pharmacy leaders are now actively using the Medicare MFP as a baseline benchmark in their commercial rebate negotiations for non-selected drugs. A PBM executive walks into a boardroom with a pharma company and says, "We know Medicare is getting a 60% discount on drug X. We want the exact same discount on your competing drug Y for our commercial patients, or we drop you from our national formulary entirely." It's like the government published the answer to the test, and now the PBMs are using the answer key to aggressively grade them on commercial papers. And it is remarkably effective. They are securing commercial discounts ranging from 25 to 60% and sometimes up to 85% in crowded therapeutic classes. The IRA is bleeding into the commercial market through a massive rebate spillover that nobody explicitly legislated. So the PBM survived by playing the commercial side, but what about the patient inside Medicare? If the government negotiates the price for a drug, does the Part D plan have to offer it to the patient? Legally, the IRA forced Part D plans to cover every dose and form of every selected drug on their formulary. But there's a massive paradox here. Covered doesn't mean preferred. The health plan are adapting to their margin compression but putting up wars. Because they can't rely on deep rebates for the negotiated drugs anymore, they aggressively manage patient utilization of those drugs. They add stop therapy, meaning you legally have to fill on a cheaper non-negotiated drug before the plan will authorize paying for the expensive negotiated one. They require complex prior authorization from your doctor, and they shift the negotiated drugs from flat fee copay tiers, like paying $20 to high percentage co-insurance tiers, where you pay 30% of the cost. Look at CVS Caremark's strategy in early 2026. Faceva is on the negotiated list for Cycle 1. The MFP is $179 for a 30-day supply because it is on the list. CVS Caremark is legally required to cover it. But Caremark was already getting massive lucrative rebates on competitive drugs in the exact same diabetes classes, like the dual. So what does the PBM do at their pharmacy and therapeutic committee meeting when they have to balance a mandate drug against a highly profitable drug? They check the compliance box. They put Forxiga on the formulary to comply with the federal law, But they take the dual the competitors with active lucrative rebates flowing back to the PBM. They move them to preferred status. They slap a step therapy. They slap a step added on Farxiga. So if doctor prescribes Farxiga, but the pharmacy says your insurance requires you to try the dual first. The negotiated drug is officially on the list, but the rebated drug is the one the patient are actually steered toward. So if the government forces a health plan to cover a drug, but the plan responds by making the patient jump through 3 administrative hoops and pay a massive co-insurance percentage just to get it, did the patient actually win anything? Lower price doesn't automatically equal to simple access. And this is the ultimate reality check. We have to ground all this high-level system strategy, the PBM mooning over the Pharma leveling, back to the individual. What does this incredibly complex web of policy actually mean for you, the listener, and for the future of patients in this country? For a specific slice of patients, those on highly complex specialty drugs, for cancer, multiple sclerosis, or severe rheumatic arthritis, this law is nothing short of a miracle. Think about a rheumatoid arthritis patient who used a biologic like Embryo back in 2024. Under the old Donahoe system, they might have paid $9,000 out of pocket every year. And maybe they gave up on treatment for 6 months because they simply couldn't afford the January reset, which leads to terrible health outcomes, disease progression, and eventually incredibly expensive hospitalizations. But in January 2026, with the 2,100 cap, the same patient hits their maximum out of pocket by April. For the remaining 8 months of the year, their embryo is completely covered. They stay on continuous therapy, the disease progression slows, the quality of life improves dramatically. That is the Part D redesign works beautifully, exactly as intended. But what about the rest of Medicare population, the median beneficiary who just takes a blood pressure pill and is statin, who comes nowhere close to hitting that catastrophic cap? The savings from the negotiated MFPs didn't actually add up too much at the pharmacy counter. In fact, CMS estimates that out of the massive top-line savings generated by negotiation, only about 1.5 billion would translate to directly beneficiary out-of-pocket savings in 2026. When you spend 1.5 billion across tens of millions of Medicare beneficiaries, you're talking about pennies a day. And remember the JAMA study, those same medium relatively healthy beneficiaries are the ones absorbing the structural blow by higher baseline premiums and the tighter formulary walls that the insurers are building to protect their margins from the liability shock. It is a massive, silent redistribution of healthcare costs. We are subsidizing the sickest patients by marginally taxing the healthiest patients through the insurance plumbing. But beyond the immediate pocketbook issues of 2026, what does this mean for the future of medicine? It is a public statement by the United States government on what a pharmaceutical breakthrough is intrinsically worth. It is a global signal. As we saw, it's becoming the anchor for commercial payers in the US. It will undoubtedly influence international reference pricing in Europe and Asia. And it is completely reshaping how manufacturers design their clinical trials and launch strategies. Which brings us to the debate of innovation. We hear the pharmaceutical industry constantly warning that if we cap our prices, if we shrink our ROI windows, we kill the cures of tomorrow. You rob the future to pay for the present. Looking honestly at the data from 2026, is this sky actually falling? We have to acknowledge the tension in partially relying purely on the market signals. The evidence is mixed, but the chilling effects are undeniably real in specific sectors. As we discussed, small molecule investment has plumped. 87% of life science investors say the IRA chose capital allocation. And perhaps more tellingly, industry-sponsored post-approval research for small molecules fell by 47% post-IRA compared to a 33% drop for biologics. Meaning companies are abandoning trials to see if an existing pill might cure a second or third disease because they know the negotiation clock is already ticking. But there's a significant counterweight to that argument that we also must acknowledge. The IRA's negotiation mechanism only applies to drugs that crank the absolute top tier in total Medicare spend. The vast majority of drugs developed will never reach that level of utilization. They will never face a maximum fair price, and as we've seen, capital isn't disappearing from the biotech sector entirely. It's just migrating. It's a shifting away from primary care pills and moving toward complex biologics and massively profitable indication where an 11-year runway still offer massive returns. The clouds are just moving over to a different neighborhood. So what does this mean of the future of medicine cabinets? If we synthesize everything we look at today, the negotiations, the liability shocks, the PBM spillover, the capital flight, the closing thesis is this: the government didn't create a clean system of winners and losers. They didn't fix drug pricing in some absolute utopian sense. It's a collision of incentives. What they did was inject a massive, unavoidable structural new price signal into the center of the healthcare market. And the entire ecosystem, patients, health funds, middlemen, manufacturers, and Wall Street investors immediately reorganized around it. And with the Supreme Court bowing out and the executive actions layering on top, government-set benchmarks are no longer a theoretical political talking point. They are the permanent operating system for the U.S. drug markets. It's a completely new era. And that leaves us with the final thought to move over. Specifically for you, the listener, we've seen how a single line of legislation regarding orphan drugs can move billions of dollars. We've seen how a 4-year difference in a timeline can kill venture capital funding for pills. If the U.S. government is not dictating the ultimate financial reward for drug development by setting these price ceilings, and if we are already seeing billions in capital flee from small molecule development to a massive biologics just to buy for extra years of profit, how long until the very definition of medical innovation fundamentally shifts? 10 years from now, with the new breakthrough drugs available to you at the pharmacy counter be based on what science deemed chemically possible? Or will they simply be out of what the government pricing algorithm deemed profitable? Thanks for joining me on this episode. See you next time.